You're listening to the Hello World Podcast number 33. My name is Sean Wildermuth and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. Today on the show is Ian Griffiths. Ian is an independent consultant, developer, speaker, and author. He's written books on Windows Presentation Foundation, Windows Forms, and Visual Studio. He lives in London, but can often be found on various developer mailing lists and news groups, where a popular sport is to see who can get him to write the longest email reply to the shortest possible question. I know Ian back from the Developmentor days, and of course, because he and I both write for Pluralsight, I was honored to finally meet him and have lunch with him now that I'm here in London. We get to chat a little bit about how he got started with really early computers, mostly because his dad's also in the business. I think you're going to enjoy this episode. Let's take a listen. So today on the Hello World Podcast, I'm delighted to have Ian Griffiths on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Good, and we haven't seen each other in a long time. Oh, wait. We just had lunch the other day, in fact.
It was literally days, yes. It seems like a long time.
It does seem like a few days with all the things. I'm here in London for the month, so I was able to finally see you, in your stomping grounds and get some good advice about the city.
How are you finding London?
I found it usually on the tube is the easiest way to find London. Really good.
And how are you liking London?
Really enjoying London. After spending a month in Paris, being able to ask exactly for what you want and, have them understand you has been a delight.
They might not be able to give it to you, but at least they understand what you want.
Exactly. No, they still can't give it to you. But at least I feel like I'm being heard.
Excellent.
So you've been in this game for a long time. How did you get started in this whole computer field?
It goes back sort of beyond the bounds of my memory, really, because my father works in this industry. So he went into computing pretty much straight out of college.
In software development or?
Yeah, in software development. So he went into an operational research division of the company that sponsored him through university and got to play with computers pretty much straight out of college, which back then that was pretty unusual. Mm-hmm. So it's been his whole career. So I've always been surrounded by these things. I grew up amongst the things, and I was actually trying to find out what was the first computer that I played with, in preparation for this podcast, because I honestly couldn't remember. These things have surrounded me. And we think the answer is an IBM card punch machine, which would have been in my father's office that I played with. So that's my first experience of computing hardware, which makes me sound quite a lot older than I am. I'm 40. Most people my age have not actually used proper punch card hardware. That's sort of museum pieces for most people, but I kind of grew up around it. So that's how I got into it, was that it was just always there. It's been my father's career, and I greatly enjoyed playing with the stuff when I was young, and it's stuck with me ever since. And really,
you were like 3 when you started, toying with the punch cards, right? I mean,
we think that's right. Yes, my dad's had to do a bit of sort of digital archaeology to work this out, because I just remember the stories of him telling me that I used to like playing with this stuff when he took me into his place of work, and he's actually gone through his CV, his resume, to work out at what point that must have been and what the hardware would have been. So he's kind of told me quite a lot of detail on this, and so I can tell you it would have been an IBM 029 punch card machine, which was actually introduced with the IBM 360, but apparently would not have been connected to one of those at the point at which I played with it. And it was also, he started using them with IBM 1401s, but again, we don't think that's what I would have used it with. I think it might actually have been one of the PDP machines, like a PDP 1140 seems to be the most likely candidate based on what he's dug up. So, but I would have been 3 or 4 at this time, and don't actually really remember very much about it, and obviously wasn't really doing what you would call programming at that stage. I think I just like the blinking lights and the fun noises and the fact that you've got a punch card out the end of it that you'd made. It's like, hey, I got the computer to make something for me. So if you actually want to talk about a computer I remember using, we would have to go forward a little bit. And again, it's a little hazy because I was surrounded by so many of the things. It's a little bit tricky to tell, but we think it was probably a Super Brain, which was a kind of CPM 80 machine.
Oh, nice.
But again, that actually wouldn't have been one I got to use very much. I probably wasn't programming on that. We think it's most likely that I was playing the Colossal Cave Adventure. Have you come across this?
I haven't, but CPMs were one of the early machines I used, so I'm surprised I haven't.
Yeah, so Colossal Cave Adventure, I think that's the right name for it. It was one of the first, if not the very first, text-based adventure game. I remember once I was teaching a class where I had mentioned this, and some of my students went and found an online playable version of it. Someone had put this on the internet because, that's what the internet's like. And their first reaction was, this is awful. They just couldn't comprehend a game so very, incredibly basic. It had, a really lousy parser. It basically forced you to enter one of a known set of verbs followed by one of a known set of nouns, and that was as sophisticated as it got. Because, the thing had to run in a little 8-bit micro. It didn't have that much space, and it had to fit the whole game in. But by the end of the week, they were all addicted to it. I felt I'd taught them something, if not necessarily what I was being paid to teach them that week.
And that was a precursor to the whole Zork bonanza.
Oh yeah. This goes back earlier than that, I believe.
Wow.
I think this is possibly the game that kicked it all off. I think it actually originally came out of a psychology research project in some university. Although I could be wrong about that. That's just on the top of my head. And as I say, this is all really the dawn of time. So I'm going to take a third attempt at answering your question. The first computer I actually got to use that I seriously programmed was a thing called a ZX81, ZX81 you might call it. I think it was marketed under the Timex brand in the US. So the Timex TMS 2000 or something of that kind.
I think they were called Timex Sinclair, whereas here they were just Sinclairs.
Right, Timex Sinclair, yes. So it was a Sinclair in the UK, and Sinclair kind of launched the home computing revolution in the UK. Apple was never quite the sort of presence with the Apple II. I mean, they were around, but you didn't see as much of them. Sinclair was the thing that an awful lot of people in the UK of my age really cut their teeth on. And the ZX81 was the second one, but it was, I think, probably the mainstream hit. The ZX80, you see a lot fewer of them around. The ZX81 really hit it big time. And that had a version of BASIC on it. So, like so many of my generation, my mind was temporarily ruined by learning on BASIC. And, so that's what I learned. And I actually had another Sinclair after that, the Sinclair Spectrum, which had color. Ooh, imagine that.
Wow.
And these are all things you plugged into your television, so you had to kind of negotiate with the rest of the family for time. But obviously, my family was quite understanding with my dad working in this area, and eventually they were generous enough to supply me with my own television so I could use the computer without disturbing the rest of the family.
That's funny. And so you started writing BASIC.
8-bit mass micro. Yes, I started writing in BASIC. I actually then went on to learn assembly language fairly early on, because one of the things that has always interested me throughout my entire career is the graphical side of things. So, these days, to the extent that I'm known at all, it is probably for XAML type stuff, mostly WPF, but other XAML technologies. And that goes back an awfully long way. Initially, it was just the joy of seeing the computer do something. Hey, look, it punched a hole in this piece of card. Instant visible results right from the start were what I liked. And if you're working on an 8-bit microcomputer with a clock speed that was measured in the megahertz, thousands of times slower than computers of today, then you pretty much had to write assembly language if you wanted things to go at any kind of speed. So I sort of started to dabble with that when I was quite young, although to be honest, it was a good few years before I was actually able to do anything useful with it. But it was sort of BASIC and assembly were my first two languages. And then that then carried on when I migrated to a computer system called the BBC Micro, which was a big deal in this country. Again, a lot of people had them. That had a BASIC that had a built-in assembler. So you didn't have to kind of hand assemble your assembly language down to machine code like you did with the Sinclair machines. Wow. With the BBC Micro, you could type in, proper assembly language, high-level stuff rather than, hex. So that's sort of the world I grew up in. And so it sort of left me a kind of details-oriented sort of a person in some ways.
So you were doing all this during, your formative education. And did that sort of lend itself to you wanting to go to college for this? Or did you start, programming professionally before then?
So technically I did start programming professionally. I think I was 16 when I got my first holiday job. That was actually doing, of all things, DBase. So I guess from the laugh you remember that. That was a very specialized system for any of your listeners who've not come across it, that was designed specifically for building database-driven apps on top of the PC system. So it was kind of like a forerunner of Access in a way, only running entirely on character mode user interfaces. This is all kind of green screens, monochrome characters and blinking cursor terminals and all that stuff. So that I had a summer job where I wrote a small project for that. You could argue I was kind of cheating because that was done for a friend of the family. So he sort of knew who I was. I think he was helping me as much as I was helping him. Well, probably more than I was helping him, frankly.
Sure, I think that's all of our first jobs, isn't it?
Well, there is that, yes. So that was I think it was a summer job when I was 16 or so. But yeah, it was pretty clear early on that I always wanted to do computing. That's what I wanted to do, and so a computer science education was a very natural path for me. There was never really any kind of question mark as to whether that was what I would do, and so that's how it worked out.
And when you were in college, was it really, I don't know what the English system's like, computer science. I know a bit about how it is in the States. Would you characterize it as, as sort of a step back from what was the modern languages, like it was at least when I was in my 20s? Or were they really, sort of more on the cutting edge of teaching you skills you were going to need when you left college?
So I think that there isn't one English system, so
Sure.
It would depend quite a lot on where you went. So had I not got into my first choice of university, I think I would have had quite a different sort of education. So my first choice was Cambridge and my second choice was Southampton. Southampton, the reason I wanted to go there was that it had a very engineering-oriented course. If I remember correctly, you actually came out with a Bachelor of Engineering degree rather than a BSc, which would be probably more common for computer science, or a BA, as Cambridge rather anachronistically still gives out for all its degrees, whether they're arts or sciences. So if I had gone there, then that would have been probably a more practical course than I actually had. But in the end, I got into Cambridge, and that was pretty academic in most respects. So to give you an idea, the language they chose as their introduction to programming course was ML, which is not the most mainstream of languages. It's a somewhat academic functional programming language, which if anyone's used F#, that actually has quite a close lineage to ML. They've got a lot of similarities. So it has actually sort of become more mainstream than it was when I did it. But one of our lecturers, Larry Paulson, I think his name was, wrote a book called ML for the Working Programmer. And there always seemed to be a kind of irony in that title, in that we'd never heard of anyone who wasn't an academic or a student who was actually using this language. But, actually these days, functional programming has gone much more into the mainstream, which I think is a good thing. But certainly in 1991, when I was there, it really wasn't. And they deliberately chose that language to make sure that people who had some practical experience didn't have a major advantage over those who didn't, because none of us would have come across this language anyway. They wanted us all to be sort of equally bamboozled. And also, obviously, they thought that functional programming had an important foundational role to play. But they did go on to teach slightly more conventional languages later, but it was quite a lot later. So there was a C course. Now, there is now, or they a few years after I left, they introduced a Java course. When I was there, it was actually Modular 3 was the sort of mainstreamish language, which they had chosen largely because it had a sort of a selection of features that you would find in quite a wide range of mainstream languages. So it was chosen to be mainstream in its feature set, if not actually in its adoption. So it meant when you came to other languages, like, oh yeah, I've seen this before and I know what sort of thing it is.
Once you've seen a loop and a function and a conditional, it's going to be similar in most languages.
Yes, and Modular 3 also, slightly ahead of its time, I guess, had more support for dealing with boundaries between components than a lot of languages did at the time. Although obviously that's now become a much more common thing with today's runtimes. Although not universally, JavaScript is arguably still more in the dark ages in that respect, but not all languages.
Not all languages.
But yeah, a lot of the course was quite academic, so there was a fair amount of stuff on things like complexity theory and sort of the finite automata, all those sorts of things. A lot of we had a lot of discrete maths in the course as well, so there was a lot of sort of foundational mathematics and theory behind it. But there was also practical stuff. There was database courses, there were software engineering sides to it, and there was also a ethics of software development. I think it was quite a wide spread of stuff that they did. But their goal, they told us after we'd graduated, was, in fact, there was a dinner some years after I'd left the college. They said the aim was to try and produce content that they thought was likely to be relevant for 10 years. They felt they couldn't really guarantee to do any longer than that, but they felt that was sort of what they should aim for. And I felt they did a pretty good job on that. A lot of the stuff I learned there that's actually becoming more relevant today than it was when I left, which is interesting.
That is interesting. So did you find yourself sort of had an affinity for languages or for systems? Or, I mean, I talked to different developers, and we all know that developer who's like, well, this is the language I believe in and all other languages are inferior, and others that are more sort of pragmatic or system related, where, we all have our little niches that we love. But I'm curious what kind of developer you kind of think of yourself as.
Well, I do love the details of a lot of languages, but I don't have a sort of loyalty to any one particular one. So, I got started with BASIC, but I never got that into Visual Basic. I moved over to C after that, and then C++, then C#. But then, I ended up getting into Haskell at one point because that actually seemed to have a lot of interesting things going for it that you couldn't get in other languages. And lately I've become interested in Clojure, which is that the Lisp derivative that runs mostly on top of the JVM or on top of JavaScript. That's interesting in that it brings a proper Lisp, but into the world of modern runtime. So I definitely don't have any one particular language loyalty, although obviously C# is quite a big part of my life. I've written O'Reilly's current programming C# book, for example, and it's what I mostly use. But it's not the only thing for me. I think it would be a real shame if it were.
Sure.
I think it's massively important to expose yourself to really fundamentally different ways of doing things. It's like I remember doing Prolog at college, and that just felt so alien to me compared to any other language I've encountered before or since, to be honest, that it's kind of, I think it's useful to have gone through the exercise of thinking your way backwards through a corkscrew like you seem to have to get anything done in that language. So yeah, I love a breadth. I just love to know as many languages as I reasonably can while still actually making a living. And also the sort of stuff I've done has varied a lot. My first full-time job after leaving college was to write kernel node device drivers.
Oh, really?
And then that seemed a bit high level. So I then went off into working into embedded real-time systems because, it's cheating having a screen and keyboard attached to your computer. That makes life far too easy.
Really does.
So I was working on stuff where the only way to debug the system was to connect a logic analyzer to the data bus and try and work out what on earth had happened before the thing locked up. So and that's a great deal of fun. It's an excellent world to work in. I can thoroughly recommend it to anyone who thinks they can deal with the pain. But I got out of it for a couple of reasons. Mainly it was that it seemed a bit like too much of a niche or niche in American pronunciation. It was a bit too narrow. I could see I'd already come across a good half of the companies I was ever going to work for if I stayed in this world. And although it's a great challenge and fascinating and extremely rewarding work, I just thought I can feel myself getting trapped into this, and I don't really want to. So and also for that reason, the pay was not as good as some, frankly, easier work. You can get more money for stuff that requires you to be less good simply because there's more demand for people with other skills. There's only so many kernel node device drivers who are required. So I sort of decided to get out of that a bit and ended up going through the sort of world of broadcast video is how I got out of that world into the higher level and have been gradually climbing my way out the stack ever since. So it's actually quite hard to pin down what particular thing I'm about. The thing I really love, though, is understanding systems in their entirety. I want to be able to understand what happens from everything down to the construction of the micro switch in the mouse, through the sort of way that transmits down the cable to the computer, the way things get across the address bus, the data bus into memory, and how the operating system handles that and delivers it to the program, what it then does to decide how to present it and get all the way back out through the graphics card to end up with a pixel on the screen changing color. It's that sort of top to bottom view, the ability to understand the whole process, or at least the aspiration to be able to do that, I think is really what drives me. I mean, you can't always do it, but because I've worked at so many different levels of the stack, I think I have a more satisfying holistic picture of the whole world than I would do if I had focused on any one thing. And I think that actually is what makes me useful as a troubleshooter. It's because I have seen so many different levels of the system. It enables me to attack problems in a lot of different ways. So I think it has been valuable in terms of just sort of getting the perspective to see where things might have gone wrong. And I get a lot of work of that kind.
Sure. And is that the kind of work that, satisfies you? I mean, because there's being good at something and, sort of the love of it as well.
So there's two things I find very satisfying, one of which is problem solving. So, for example, the times when I spent a couple of weeks trying to hunt down a hardware bug that was causing things to fall over in certain places in the device driver world I used to live in. It was a pretty hellish 2 weeks, but the feeling at the end of it, when I worked out what was actually going on and discovering that it wasn't a bug in my code, it was actually a hardware problem, unusually, that sort of thing is extremely satisfying, although the process of getting there is pretty unpleasant. But the destination's great. So I do get a great deal out of troubleshooting, but I don't think that would be enough for me. I think the creativity is important. The ability to actually sit down and say, I'm going to build something up here. I'm going to create a thing, and having people use a thing that you have built matters a great deal to me. I want to make things that are useful. I want to make things that people have used and have found has improved their lives. And that, I think, is actually what drives me more. So if I had to pick one, it probably would be the building systems. But thankfully, if you build systems, you get to do lots of the troubleshooting, because, you build them wrong to start with. So you've got to find out why they're not working.
Well, something that sort of interested me, and I've been wanting to ask some people about that, is we talk a lot and get caught up as developers in sort of the technical part of our job. And I'm sort of believing that, when I look back in my career at least, that a big chunk, maybe as much as half of my job, hasn't been typing. Right? It hasn't been working and debugging. As much as half of my job sometimes is that, how do we know what we're building? And if you're interested in that building part, how do you ever get good at that other part? Because I think a lot of us tend to be a little introverted. Yes.
In fact, this is a very interesting topic that I'm sort of in the middle of an argument about this right now on Twitter. There's a guy who is arguing that static typing is everything, that nothing else fundamentally has meaning, because you can reason about types, that they're essentially theorems, and you can prove things with them in a way that you can't with, for example, names of things, and therefore static typing is more important than naming, is essentially the argument he seems to be making. And I profoundly disagree with that, because I think, well, first of all, you're going to build things wrong. Right. So you might have a beautiful type system that perfectly encapsulates your mistakes. And I think that there has to be something outside of that, which you can refer to say, well, is the thing I built actually what I meant to build? And is it what other people were expecting me to build? So I think language is, and I don't mean programming languages, I mean human language, natural language, is of fundamental importance to building correct systems, because everything has to begin with a conversation, right? You've got to talk to whoever it is that's going to use whatever you're building, and try and work out how best you can help them, find out what they think they want, and then more importantly, try and work out what you can actually give them and find out whether that's actually going to solve their problems. So I think it's hugely important to talk. Talking to customers, talking to users matters an enormous amount. And I guess I've been lucky in my career in that I've got to do quite a lot of this because initially, as I started to work as a freelance consultant after leaving my full-time job, in an awful lot of cases, I was bringing quite specific knowledge of a particular technology into the team. What they really wanted was for me to impart that knowledge to them and then get the heck out again because I was too expensive. So, it's the transfer of understanding has always been a critical part of my job, which is then what got me into teaching.
Sure.
And I taught for a long time for Developmentor and then Pluralsight. And I've written quite a few books. I think that I'm lucky that it's something I enjoy. I seem to have a reasonable amount of success some of the time in explaining what it is I mean. And I think that is something that is a little bit kind of lacking in our industry. Not everyone practices it. A lot of people don't really enjoy it. And I think actually the reason I'm having this argument with this guy is that I have seen often a tendency to try and quotes solve quotes the human issues problems by converting everything into a world of formalism. So, for example, I really dislike approaches to user interface building that try and automate everything. Like, let's say I've got a database and I press a button and now I've got a website on top of the database. It's like, well, yes, but it's going to be awful because your users don't want to work with your database, and you need to think about what's the model you're presenting to them, which doesn't necessarily have to be the same as the model that you're working on internally. In fact, it often shouldn't be. I think this is often misunderstood about user interface building. I think people often think it's easier than it is and end up doing it very badly because of that. And it's you need to understand how your program is going to communicate concepts to people, and it's always a mistake to try and reduce that to a formalism because the formalism happens to be tractable. And I think there's lots of traps like that in computing. There's lots of very sort of shiny, seductive looking, interesting technical systems that let you ignore the messy human angle. But I always think you end up with worse systems when you do that. I think you have to just embrace the messiness, the fuzziness, and say, well, we're not going to be sure what we're building. We're probably going to build the wrong thing for a bit, but we just need to maintain a constant dialogue. So, I mean, you asked, how do you get good at that? I think you just have to do it and do it and do it. And I think if you find it unpleasant, you just sort of have to grasp the nettles. There's always something about any given job that is distasteful but necessary. For different people, that's different things. I actually happen to quite enjoy talking to people, but I know a lot of people would rather lock themselves away at a desk and avoid their customers as much as they can. Well, you've got to do it. There's things I don't like. I don't like selling, but I have to because otherwise I can't eat. So, you just have to work out what's the stuff you need to be doing that you'd rather not do, and could you work better if you were to embrace the stuff you don't like. So fundamentally, it's about going, yes, I know I don't like this, but I've got to do it anyway. I think that's what it has to boil down to.
To enjoy the stuff you like doing, you're going to have to do the stuff that in some cases you don't like doing.
Absolutely, yes.
I find it fascinating because I do run into that sort of problem where people are like, we would like to create this sort of magic way that the people can interact with the database. And to me, there's sort of a flaw already, and that is this idea that the users need to know that there's a database, right? Because that's not how most users or most systems, whether it's enterprise developers or people on their iPhones, they don't want to or need to know how you're storing it, what's being stored, any of that. And that's, I think, where we agree in that sort of that automated UI development almost always falls apart because it's exposing all these artifacts of these technical details that not only aren't important to the user, but can get in the way of the user.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And you've reminded me obliquely of a quote from Tim Ewald, I can never remember how to pronounce his surname, but he used to work at Developmentor, and he, I think it was pretty sure it was him. He once said the phrase, "Very few users are asking for us to make more object-oriented programs." It's like that's not what people care about. That the internals that we naturally get very excited about as techies are just not often that interesting to the user, and surfacing stuff, the actual stuff that's beneath there may seem hugely attractive if you're a developer. It's like, yeah, I'd love to see that stuff and be able to interact with it. It would feel like I was, in the Matrix or something. It's like, yeah, most people don't actually want that. Normal users need something else. And I think that, to be honest, the only way to get that right is iteration, trial and error, lots and just go through it again and again and again. So one job I had for a while was working on what is essentially the UK answer to TiVo. I mean, there's more than one system in the UK, but one of the most widely used ones. I worked as the lead engineer during the prototyping phase on it. And what we did for about 6 months is there were three of us, me, the lead engineer, the lead designer, and the project manager would talk about what we were thinking about changing in the app. I would go away and implement it, and then we put it in front of a focus group, and then the following Monday we'd meet again and go, wow, we're not as smart as we thought we were, as we discovered just how different the user's perception of the app was from what we thought it would be. We'd come up with something that we thought was crystal clear, totally obvious, understandable to anyone, and it just hadn't occurred to us how people would respond to it in ways that were just beyond us. Like, you can see where they were coming from after the fact, but you just wouldn't see it coming. And so the only possible way to build working systems like this is to put prototypes in front of people, see what they do, and then think about it and go, how else could we do this? And just brainstorm, try again, try as many things as you can, and eventually you will converge on something that is actually usable. But it's not something that you're ever going to get by just surfacing the technical underpinnings. That's about the worst possible approach, in my view.
I find it a tad ironic, too, because we tend to think developers are smart people and we can do these things, but we're often the worst people to develop the UIs, because we are people that will put up with pain if we get a payoff. And that's the opposite of almost every user we're writing code for.
Yes, well, there's the classic joke, isn't it, about if you give a developer and an ordinary user a task to do with Excel that's going to take 30 hours to do and is highly repetitive, the developer will happily spend 29 and a half hours automating it and then take the final half hour off, whereas most people would just sort of do it. But of course, the follow-up joke to that is, the developer is the one who'll spend 60 hours automating the half-hour process and and then take the remaining minus 30 hours off. So, we I think like the complexity as well. I think it's not just that we're prepared to tolerate it. I think there's something about the pain that attracts us in a way.
Masochistic in some ways.
Yeah, I think there is. I think you kind of have to be to successfully debug a program.
As long as the payoff's there, it is that.
The payoff has to be there. It's definitely no fun if you don't solve it. That's true.
That's absolutely true. And so, when you started doing teaching, was that sort of a natural next step, or was that a risk you took?
I never saw it coming. It certainly wasn't a thing that I thought I would end up doing, because I did not enjoy school at all. And by school, I should qualify, I'm using that in the English sense. We don't call university school. So everything prior to college, I pretty much hated it, to be honest. It's partly an issue with authority, but also my school did a lot of sport and I really wasn't into that. There were a number of reasons I didn't like school. I loved university. That was great, but I didn't like the teachers, a lot of the teachers. Some of them were great. There were a few that I did like, but a lot of them
in case they're listening. Yeah.
Yeah. You know who you are, the ones that I liked. I just kind of couldn't comprehend the idea of becoming a teacher. I'd be becoming the enemy at that point. So that's sort of how I thought of it earlier in my career. It's like that's clearly a thing I'm never going to do. And then yet I found myself doing it about sort of 8 or 9 years into my career. And the thing that changed really was I was doing a lot of this explaining of stuff that I was brought in because I knew it and was trying to help people get up to speed so I could leave and go somewhere else. I did a lot of that and I found that I really enjoyed it. So it occurred to me, well, actually, maybe I could do this. And I sort of got a slightly better understanding of what it was I didn't like about school. It wasn't teaching per se. It was really fundamentally the authority relationships that were a bit messed up that I didn't get on with. And those don't have to exist when you're teaching adults. It's a completely different world. And so I came to understand it's like, well, actually, the whole side of explaining stuff and helping people to get their heads around stuff, that can actually be really positive. And so I thought, well, I'll give it a try. I was out of the blue, really. I saw someone had posted on the old DCOM mailing list, a guy called Kevin Jones had posted, and his email signature said Develop Mentor UK. And I was like, oh, I didn't know they were in the UK. So I just emailed out of the blue, said, are you hiring? And took it from there, really, and had the sort of telephone interview and went on. And it was a bit of a shot in the dark, really, because I didn't have any way of knowing if I'd actually like it and how good I'd be at it. But the very first time I tried it, it was, I loved it. It was great. It's like, okay, yeah, this is a thing I have to do. It's not the only thing I want to do, because I think you need to be a practitioner as well if you want to be an effective teacher in our world. I think you got to do a mixture. But yeah, it was great. But yeah, it was totally unexpected until it actually happened. Really, it was a surprise.
Nice. And so where do you find yourself these days with building systems? I know that you do more software development than you used to do teaching, but some of that's driven by your new family, your kids.
Yeah. Yes. So lately, the last couple of years, which is how long I've had a family, I have been doing a lot of just straightforward development work and some consulting work, but pretty much all local. I live in London. There's a lot of clients here, so it's possible to do that sort of work without traveling if you live here. And so a lot of it has been actually cloud-based recently. So I have been doing a lot of Azure work, frequently in conjunction with front ends of one kind or another. So it'll be either WPF on top of Azure, or Windows 8 or Windows Phone on top of Azure, or other phone stuff as well. Although I'm not really, I have dabbled in Mac OS and iOS and so on, but I'm not exactly an expert in those. So it tends to be more Microsoft front end and generic Azure based back end. So that's been kind of fun in that initially when I first sort of Azure was announced at Build, I was at the Build conference where they sort of unveiled it all, and my initial response was, this is important, worthy, and I'm not that interested in it. It's sort of like, I don't know, power cables. Got to be there, really important. They've got to work, got to be good. But that just don't excite me all that much. It was all sort of infrastructure. But I think since that launch, the Azure team has done a great job of actually making most of the boring stuff their problem. So they've done a pretty good job of making it so you can focus on what it is you're actually trying to achieve, what goals you're trying to solve. So it's actually been quite good fun. Yeah, and there is something nice about being able to spin up, thousands of machines if you want to in the blink of an eye and that sort of thing. It's moderately interesting. I get a little kick out of that sort of thing. It's a geeky thrill. So yeah, and I've been moving all my own infrastructure over to that. So my internal build server and weblog and stuff are all now sort of cloud-based, whereas I used to have to administer my own servers for that sort of thing. So yeah, that's been that seems to me to be it's inevitable. Everything is going to move in that direction sooner or later. So it's an important thing to be in. And yeah, I've sort of been doing the XAML stuff. Still seems to keep coming. It's not necessarily the most visible and sexy thing at the moment, but there's actually quite a lot of work in it.
Sure.
And if I'm permitted a small plug, I've actually written a Windows Phone app recently that I've just launched, which if you go to my blog or Twitter feed, you'll see me blathering about. So I won't talk about it now, but just want to mention it quickly.
Nice. Speaking of XAML, we don't talk specifically about technologies that much, but I'm curious if you've looked at any of the XAML form, the Xamarin Form stuff that they're using XAML with. Because when I kind of saw that, it sort of re-excited some old muscles.
So unfortunately, I have been in a position where I've needed to earn a living over the last few months and have not had any time to play with that since it emerged. I have been heads down on doing stuff for my customers. So it looks extremely exciting, but unfortunately I've got pretty much zero insight to offer into that, I'm afraid. So sorry about that. Great question, rubbish answer.
I was hoping, you would do that, because I'm in the same position. The last 4 months with getting married and moving and all that, I haven't had a chance to even, open up the IDE and look at it. So I was hoping I was going to cheat a little and get a tiny little training from you. So, oh well. It was worth
all I can say is I've heard good things from people whose opinion I respect, but I know nothing firsthand.
That's funny. So I'd like to end on a question I've started the last few podcasts with, and that is, if you look back at the last 10 or 15 years of your career, is there anything you would have changed, a decision that would have moved into something more quickly, would have decided not to do, that hindsight being 2020?
I've had such a blast over the last 20 years. I'm not actually sure that I would, to be perfectly honest.
That's a fair. That's a fair answer.
Yeah, I am very lucky that I get to do a lot of stuff that I find interesting. So, the only possible thing, given perfect foresight, the only possible thing I might change is investing in stuff I knew was going to go up. But that's not a very technically interesting answer. It just means I could spend more of my time doing stuff that doesn't necessarily have to pay the bills. So no, I think in terms of the technologies I've got to work with, it's difficult to imagine how I could have had a broader, more interesting spread than I've got. So no, I wouldn't change anything.
That's a completely fair answer. Well, I want to thank you so much for doing the podcast. I was really excited to get you on, and I love the story of, imagining you playing with punch cards at 3. It's a very vivid picture in my head now.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Hello World Podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the Hello World Podcast at hwpod.com.